record-based file manager. In particular, it has, all you had to deal with was insert record in project 1. In project 2, you're gonna have to deal with deleting a record and updating a record. And we've already talked about how the delete and update can get done. A page is always gonna consist of 3 things. At the beginning of the page, you're gonna have your records, and they'll be consecutive with no free space. Then you'll have your free space, which you're gonna have to keep track of, and you did it in project 1, you'll see how we did it in our project 1 solution, so you'll have the free space. And then you'll have the slot directory. And of course, the areas can change around as records get inserted, but they also change around as records get deleted and updated. For example, what happens when a record gets deleted? The space that it had is no longer being used, so you will take that space in your record storage on the page, and you'll move all the records that are after it back so that they cover that space. Which means that in the slot directory where you had offsets, the offsets are gonna change. An RID consists of an offset and a length. And so the offsets of the records are gonna change because you moved everybody back, because we're gonna keep the free space consecutive. The lengths don't change, just the offset change. What happens to that RID? Well, the RIDs have to be permanent, but only as long as the record exists, which means that that slot potentially could end up getting reused. A slot consists of a page ID and an RID. So that slot could potentially end up getting reused. And I'm gonna be asking you how you end up approaching that issue. That's part of what you have to describe in the report, because you don't wanna run out of slots if there's still, room on the page and so on. You don't wanna waste slots in the slot directory. What happens when you do an update? Well, there are a couple of cases. If the size of the record is the same as it was before, then you can just update it in place and not mess around with it. The slot directory is fine. But if the record got shorter, you don't want to waste space. So you're gonna have a shorter record, and what you want to do is take all the records that appeared after that in your record space and move them back so you reclaim the extra 12 bytes or whatever it is. What do I mean by a later record? I don't mean a later slot, I mean something that appeared in a position that was later inside that record space. So you move those back so that you take those extra 12 bytes that aren't being used so that things don't end up being wasted. Because all your free space is gonna be in the part in the middle. Again, records, free space, the slot directory going backwards. No head-on collisions, gotta be careful about that. So that way, as with the case in which you delete, you'll pull everything that was later back to be able to do with it. Everybody okay on that one? What happens if the record becomes longer? Well, you can treat that as a delete and an insert. In fact, you could treat even the case where it gets shorter as a delete and an insert. Because you take the record that, let's just take the shorter case, you delete the record and then you put it back, and there'll always be room for it in the new free space area that you have after that record has been deleted. So you could do it as a delete and an insert. That's all an update really can be thought of as being, delete and an insert. But what happens, let me go through the last case and then I'll take the question. What happens if the record becomes longer? Well, again, there are 2 cases. Either there is enough space for it on that page or there isn't. So you do the update by treating it as a delete. And then after the delete, you see whether or not there's enough room on the page to be able to put the new longer record. Easy case, there's enough room. You put it in on the page. And again, that record's length has changed because it's gotten longer, and its offset has changed because you're putting it where it goes. And of course, as usual with delete, the things that appeared later on the page have to get moved up. But then there's the fun case, the one that's going to require the most slot on this, where I'm giving you some hints. I posted something called the note on forwarding addresses that deals with that. You're going to put the record on a different page. Well, hold on a second. The record was on page 17 and now you're putting it on page 25. But the RID is supposed to be permanent while the record exists. But that's okay because you leave a forwarding address. What's a forwarding address? Well, you've got 2 fields in the slot directory. You've got the length and you've got the offset. what you'll do is, instead of using those two fields as a length and an offset, you'll use them instead as an RID, that is, a page ID and a slot ID, on the new page where the record is being placed in its longer form. And so when you're looking for the record, instead of there being a length and an offset, there will be a RID, which is to say a page ID and a slot ID, and you'll find that record in the other place. Well, hold on a second, everybody is saying, unless you remember my describing this before. How do I tell the difference between it being a length and an offset versus it being an RID of the new place where the record is put, an RID again with a new page ID and a slot ID? Answer, you take a bit. For example, you go ahead and use the offset. You could do it with length too. Let's assume we're doing it with offset. You make the offset be negative if you're coercing it into being not an offset and a length, but rather a page ID and an RID. This is the ugly, unprincipled way of doing it. Let me go through it and then I'll give you a more principled way of doing it, which those of you who are purists will want to use, and in fact it is somewhat of a better choice. But the idea is that instead of you're having a offset and a length, you tell, because the offset is negative, sorry, nothing can ever be a negative offset. It could be zero, but it can never be negative. So when it's a negative offset, you'll say, oh, this isn't a length and an offset. This is a RID, which is to say a page ID and a slot ID. This is described to some extent in the note that I posted on this. And so you'll say, oh, I'm not going to look for this on this page. I'm going to look for it by using the other IID to find new page ID and slot ID, and I'll find the record there. And that's how the thing works. Now, what do I mean by having a more principled way? Well, if I'm going ahead and I'm using whatever number of bits a page ID is, and slot ID and offset and whatever, maybe you're working with 32 bits, maybe you're working with 16 bits for each of them. It's basically saying the lead bit is a flag instead of a sign. So treat it in a principled way as something where the lead bit in the value is a flag that tells me whether or not the thing is a length and an offset or is an RID, which is to say a page ID and a slot ID. And so I use one fewer bit as an actual value, but I use the lead bit to tell me it's a flag. Which is it? Is it telling me about length and offset on this page, or is it telling me about the forwarding address where the thing ends up going? Now, two issues that I asked you to think of, questions about this. You had a question, I was making you wait.
I think you answered it.
Okay, I had a feeling I might, but then there are two other questions that you need to think about. And I'm not going to tell you how to solve these, just as I didn't tell you how you reuse the deleted slot. You have to think about that one too. Number one of the operations that you're going to need to perform is a scan. I told you that this thing is about completing the RBFM, but you're also going to be defining a relation manager. For a relation, you don't insert records, you insert tuples. Insert tuple is going to be something at the relation manager level, the RM level, which is going to be based on insert tuple at the, which is based on insert record at the RBFM level. So record-based file manager deals with records, relations deal with tuples. So for every operation on records that you have at the RBFM level, you'll end up having an operation that deals with tuples that's at the relation manager. Relations have tuples. Relations also have something else. They have catalogs. We went over this previous lecture. Catalogs have information, in this case, about tables and about attributes, sometimes called columns. They have things about tables, like the name of the column, the file in which the thing appears, might have the number of different columns in the table, things like that. You get to, I give you a hint about some things you can have. You may have to add more. Attributes have things like the position of the attribute. It's attribute 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. The type of the column, the length of the column, or the max length of the column if it's varchar. Things that are true for every tuple. if you're inserting a tuple into a table, you're gonna know from the relation manager how to do that, because you know in the catalog the description of all the information about the tuples that appear inside that particular table. This is the magic of how relational databases work. You know what every tuple is supposed to look like based on the description of the table and the attributes that are in the catalogs. And so you can insert tuples not based on magic from above, but on a description that comes in and a description of how the thing is supposed to look inside the table that you have inside the catalogs. And by the way, the most interesting part about that is not only do the catalogs describe all the tables that you've created, you can also destroy a table. It's called destroy table in this sequence drop. But not only do the catalogs have information about the tables you've created, the catalogs have information about the catalogs. Bertrand Russell and Catalog Let All Catalogs Be Damned. The catalogs describe themselves as tables too. And so you're gonna have a kind of bootstrapping thing where when you end up doing the thing that creates the catalogs, it, in a less principled way, creates the information about the catalogs in the catalogs. The catalog, the table catalog has to be described in the table catalog and the attribute catalog. The attribute catalog has to be described inside the table catalog and the attribute catalog. Question?
So when we do, for example, read tuple, will we have a pointer to the start of the catalog, or is there?
They're fixed. They're fixed. Look, you basically know what the catalogs are.
Okay.
You're gonna have. I mean, you're allowed to have a constant which gives you the information about the catalog.
Got it.
So you always got to bootstrap with something. You got to have something to hold on. You got to have an anchor. Otherwise, you're constants aren't bad.
Okay.
Okay. Or variables that you set and reuse. But you'll see. And there you're given an rm.h and an rm.c again, as well as of course dealing with the extension to the RBFM. So RM. So you complete RBFM. You write a relation manager that understands about relations and uses the underlying record stuff to be able to do the operations on tuples, but gets information about stuff from the catalogs. It's easier than it sounds. Read the description of the projects, read the files, ask questions inside the labs. But now I want to get to the two interesting operations. Scanning all the tuples, which maps to scanning all the records inside a file. Suppose that you have a forwarding address. And some of you may figure out the answer to this question. There's more than one. There's a really simple one. Don't yell it out here. Talk about it with your teammates. Work it out. But the question that I'm asking is, when you do a scan, you got two guys that are referencing the tuple, the actual place where the record is, and the forwarding address. But when you do a scan, you don't want to touch the record twice. There are easy ways of solving the question. If I'm looking up the record based on an RID, I will be looking it up based on its permanent RID, which will in turn give me a forwarding address, which is the new RID where it got put, but I don't want to touch the record twice when I scan. Fun question, easy answer. Second question, which also has a relatively easy answer, but it's something to think about. I move a page, a record, it didn't fit on its original page. I move it to another page, so I have a forwarding address for it. And now I make it longer still. I could have another forwarding address, forward to a new place, forward to a newer place, but you can do better than that. Because potentially, if I end up having to forward it 17 times, I have to follow 17 forwarding addresses to find it. You can do better than that. In the report, I'm asking you to explain how you approach that. And again, it's easy, and some of you may have already figured out ways to do it. But it's one of the aspects of thinking about how to make all this work. Okay? And again, you can ask questions during office hours, during labs. You will have both Saloni and Matthew who will help you be able to deal with these things. Again, the files, the two files, project and project description for project 2 have been posted. And I also posted a moderately detailed note about forwarding address that helps explain the stuff that I briefly went over about the difference between having offset and length versus having the new RID, which is to say the new page ID and the new slot ID there. Other questions about this that I haven't answered and I'm potentially willing to answer? Okay. 10 weeks is a short term, it always is. I hate to mention this, but there's a midterm on May 6th. This is the end of week 3. So that's on the first day of week 6. I'm just gonna be doing a reminder. You can, once again, as you could do in 180, bring in the cheat sheet, no cheating, but you can bring in a 2-sided 8.5 by 11 sheet with whatever you want written or printed on it, no sharing. You can share to prepare it, you can't share to write it. And I do want to remind everybody, because I don't have it on every lecture, that although the material in this course is somewhat dense, the textbook has a lot of the material that I'm going over in class. And just as a reminder, I added this slide. It tells you what chapters of the textbook we're going over as we go through the lectures. There is a bunch of material, particularly in the CODAs, that does not appear in the textbook. That's because what's in the CODAs generally was done after the textbook was written. But, for example, we are at a point today where, and we're off just a little bit from the schedule, we'll be talking about ISAM and B+ trees today. And we'll be starting on the hashing stuff next week. I should be able to get through this lecture today, so congratulations, you have a 1 lecture. Unusual. And to make that happen, I'm gonna go through it, but what I wanna emphasize is you've been told what chapters we're going through, and so much of the material we go over appears inside the textbook. So if you're finding the going a little complicated in the lectures, read ahead, read after. You can read during if you insist, but I prefer you pay attention to the lectures, it's up to you. Okay, so as a reminder, there are 3 alternatives for dealing with data entries when you have an access path. Basically, you can store the data record in the entry, in the hash table, or inside the B tree. You can store the search key, and which could be a multi-attribute search key, together with the records that correspond to it, one by one, e.g. California, the student in California, the student in California. Or you can store the search key together with the list of the RDs. The last 2 are very similar to each other. And again, it ends up being, orthogonal. You can use any of these 3 methods for any access method that you want. Hashing supports equality searches nicely, but tree with B trees help you with range and equality, so that's nice. We're gonna go back in time a little bit. We're gonna take out a DeLorean and go back a little bit. We'll talk about something that existed before you had B trees. With hashing, we're gonna go forward in time. We talked about static hashing, and later on we're gonna get to dynamic hashing. A hashing method that dynamically expands. But now we're gonna talk about something that happened before there were B trees. B trees, as we've seen, dynamically adjust nicely when there are inserts and deletes and stay balanced. Log to the base F is the number of N is the number of levels you have, or N is the number of leaves. ISAM was a static structure that happened before it. Still ends up having uses to be able to figure out how things work. And here's the general idea of what's going on with respect to our friend ISAM. Not SAM-IM, but ISAM. So the general idea is you want to be able to do something like find all students whose GPA is more than 3. And if the data is in a sorted file, then that's nice. You can do a binary search and just find where 3 is, and then everybody in the sorted file is inside your answer. So that's very, very pleasant. But the cost of the binary search could potentially be high if n is big enough. Log n is pretty good, but it also there's the cost of actually maintaining the file to be sorted. But what you can do instead is have a very simple kind of index file, and you'll see the resemblance of this to B trees, where what you do is you just have a page pointer again, and this is like what we had with the page pointers inside the B tree or B+ tree. You have all the values. You have a range of keys, and here this page 1 has all the things that are less than K1. Page 2 has all the things that are greater or equal to K1 and less than K2. Et cetera, et cetera. So that really is very much like the way a B tree works, and it's very, very pleasant. Okay, but the index file can end up being quite large. And again, you'll see the resemblance to B trees, but B trees are mostly better. The index file could be large, but you can recursively apply the same idea at multiple levels of the tree, which again is what a B tree does. So then you have this multi-level stuff, and it's exactly what we did. The leaf pages, as usual, contain the data entries. But here's the difference. If you run out of room in the leaf pages, you can start creating overflow pages. Instead of going ahead and doing the rebalancing, which even if things are coming in time order, it will end up being balanced. But you can do this stuff where you have overflow pages, you have the primary leaf page that corresponds to a value, and you can have overflow pages when there's more stuff going on. And what's the good and what's the bad thing about it? Well, suppose that you have a file and you know the range of values. For example, suppose that the file isn't going to be changing very much. Then you can just go ahead and create this tree very nicely. The same way that you could create a B tree very nicely if you do initial load of the B tree. If you know what the data is like, you create the B tree from the beginning, have it starting at the leaf levels and then building up on top of it. So that's basically what you're doing here. You're building the pages for the data, and then you're building the tree on top of it. So you go ahead and allocate index pages, put things in. And if you're creating it from the beginning, there are no overflow pages. But it could be that things get put in. You might leave a little bit of free space in the leaf pages, but over time, it could be that you end up having a situation where you don't have enough room. And so, again, we're not doing the B tree stuff. This was pre-B tree. We're taking our DeLorean and going back to 1955. It is rather scary for those of you who've seen that movie. The movie took place in 1985. They went back to 1955, and then they went to Back to the Future, which was 2015, i.e. 4 years ago. But here we're going back in time without a DeLorean, and we're looking at something that preceded B trees. And the idea is that you end up having these things where you can go ahead and you have the stuff inside where if the data entries are in the leaf page, then you can just go ahead and find them basically the same way that we that we did with respect to the B trees. And again, doing a search, you start at the root, you use the same comparisons we did in B trees to be able to find things that are going on. That funny sort of symbol basically says that the I/O cost is going to be proportional to log to the base of m, and where again f is going to be the fan out, n is the number of leaf pages. To do an insert, you just find the leaf where the data entry belongs and you put it there. You can always put it there because worst come to worst, you just create an overflow page. So you're putting it inside the leaf pages, which consist of the index pages and the overflows. Delete. You delete it. If you've got an empty overflow page and you can coalesce overflow pages and other pages, then you can remove it. And again, everything is, the tree itself is static. You're never reorganizing the tree. So what's good and what's bad about this? Insert and delete in a B tree are kind of complicated. You don't have to deal with it. Save yourself some complex code. Well, it's not that complex code. You'll see that you have to deal with parts of this in Project 3, by the way. Not the ISAM, the B tree. But what's wrong with this? Suppose that the data really is changing and it ends up coming in, let's say, based on time, and usually time goes forward. Sometimes you'll get a reading that's old, but mostly time is going forward. You're going to get a heck of a lot of stuff in your overflow pages. So this is not a self-organizing tree. It's simple, it's easy to play with, but it's not self-organizing. So again, suppose that each node can hold just 2 entries, not real, more like 200, or these days more like maybe 20,000, about what's going on. So this would be an example of how this thing would end up working. Here's a static tree that you've created and how everything ends up working. And let's just go ahead and see what happens. We insert the 23, so that this was the original tree, no overflow pages. We create it, and if everything isn't changing very much, all this gets nice. But when we wanted to put the 23 in, then, you know, there are all the values that are less than 20, here are all the values between 20, that are greater or equal to 20 and less than 33, right? So when we put the 23 in, there's no room to put the 23, we'll chain it off. Over here, you know, if the 30, everything that's greater or equal to 33 and less than 40 is gonna go here. Everything greater or equal to 41 to the right. So, you know, all nice putting in the 23, but now what we're gonna do is we're gonna put in 48 and 41 and 42. And again, we're putting in entries for them. And so the 48, there's no room, we're gonna move it over there. Then the 41 comes in, well, put it on that overflow page. And then the 42 comes in, and we're gonna have to need another overflow page. Question?
So the overflow pages aren't sorted?
You can if you want to, but that makes the that makes the insertion a little more complicated. The answer to your question is, you get your choice as to which variation of ISAM you wanna be able to use here, or just keeping it simple and putting in things on overflow pages. But think about this, if I have a lot of stuff, a lot of overflow pages, and I have to keep everything sorted, that's a lot of work, where with a lot of overflow pages, there's a lot of work to do. It will make my searching perhaps a little bit easier, but it will make, but again, I don't have a tree about what's going on here. You know, it's not an index, it's just the value. So even if I kept it sorted, there would be a lot of work involved. So that's the basic idea. And now, if I deleted 42 and 51 and 97, so again, let's look at what happens. I want to delete the value 42. When I delete the 42, I'm going to get rid of that overflow page, which is what I'm going to do. When I delete the 48, then let's see what ends up happening. I'll be deleting the 48 from its overflow page. When I delete the 41, I get rid of, that was the inserting. I want to delete 42, 51, and 97. So again, let me do it in order. So I want to delete the 42, and again, that overflow page goes away. I want to delete the 51. What happens? Too far wrong direction. I want to delete the 51, so I got rid of the 42. I want to delete the 51, then this slot over here, you know, becomes empty. So the 51 isn't there. And then the last thing that I want to delete, I want to delete the 97, and all that happens is that slot for the 97 becomes free. So this is just what everything looks like. Got rid of the 42 in its overflow page, got rid of the value that was here, and got rid of the value that was there, and that's how all this stuff works. And it's relatively simple. ISAM stands for Index Sequential Access Method. It was one of many such access methods that IBM in particular came up with and defined, and it was useful. And again, reminder, this sort of is a much simpler, much less self-balancing, because it doesn't self-balance at all. Thing compared to a B-tree, where again, we have the leaf pages that are sorted by search key. They are ordered. The leaf pages contain data entries that are changed, the non-leaf of index entries. It's a lot like ISAM, but not quite the same. Question?
So when you do a deletion, you don't update the index at all? So for example.
Oh, are we asking about ISAM or B-tree?
ISAM.
When you do the deletion, the traffic cops are still fine, just as they were in B-trees.
Okay.
Traffic cops can maintain their functions even if the values are no longer in the tree. We saw that in B-trees, we also see that in ISAM.
Got it.
All the job of a traffic cop is to tell you which way to go. I'll say more about that a little bit later. Traffic cops don't even have to be values that ever were in the trees, they just have to be traffic cops. Okay, so, that's a B-tree. How do these things compare? And that's part of the point of this lecture, to talk about alternatives and how they compare. Because B-trees, ISAM isn't used a whole lot anymore. B-trees, of course, have no overflow pages. Uniform height all the time. Everything is, all the leaves are at the same level. Okay, so it's the identical time for search for any search key in the B-tree. What could happen to ISAM over time?
Tilted one.
Yeah, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Notre Dame isn't what it used to be, but Hunchback of Notre Dame. By the way, the book was used to raise funds for the restoration of Notre Dame in Victor Hugo's time when he wrote it, and it's being used now for restoration of Notre Dame as well. But you can end up getting a hunchback tree leaning over to one side or the other. Pick your favorite, left or right. which is not what you want. And of course, remember, the price that we pay for dealing with this wonderful constant search time, constant insert and delete time, is that we do have to mess around with the splitting and the merging that goes on. The question that will be important for something else I get to as part of the coda for this lecture. When I do an insert into a B tree, how many writes might I have to do when I do an insert or an update?
One.
More than one. Say it again, louder.
The height of the tree.
Which is log to the base F of n. Because there might be things when I do the insert where I have to propagate up. The parents inherit the problems of the kids. It might be something where I have to do splits going all the way up the tree. In fact, I might have to split the root, which increases the height by it. Because the thing has to stay balanced. Splitting may propagate all the way up the tree. So could merging if I do deletions. So inserts, updates, and deletes could require log of n write. So it's a little bit complicated code to write. You're gonna have to deal with inserts in project 3. Deletes are an extra credit, or something I leave them as an extra credit. Deletes are harder than inserts, quite a bit harder. Anyway, that's coming in project 3. Now you're worried about project 3. But the point is that, what I'm emphasizing is that doing the operation can sometimes require a bunch of writes, not just where you're inserting it, because there might not be enough room. You might have to split all the way up, in the worst case, to be able to do it. Foreshadowing of what's to come. So, more details about this. There is a notion of doing prefix key compression. Remember what I just said? All a traffic cop has to be is somebody who tells you where to go. Suppose that I've got a character string. I've got a character string is like 400. Do I have to store all 400 characters to tell me where to go? I'm sure after project 1, a lot of you want to tell me where to go, but with respect to this character string, which is 400 characters long, do I need all 400 characters to tell me whether to go left or right? All I need is a prefix of them, which is enough to tell me whether to go left or right. I can do what's called prefix compression. I need enough characters so that I can differentiate between basically the biggest thing on the left and the smallest thing on the right. Really what I need is enough so that I can tell when I have to go to the right rather than to the left. So I don't have to keep everything, which by the way will allow me to squeeze more into a non-leaf node. So I can go ahead and do that. Then there's bulk loading. By the way, I am going to be going through slides on each of these, but I'm giving you, again, the taste. Every one of these is a slide or two in what's coming. Then there's the notion of bulk loading, which I've already alluded to. Often when you're creating a B tree on a bunch of data, you already know what the data is. It could change over time. But how do you create the B tree efficiently when you start? And we'll talk more about that. I've alluded to it, but we'll actually go through how that works. We'll have a summary of what's inside this section. And then we'll have a coda on something which is very important today. B trees are still important, but there's something which I will go into in detail in lecture 13. I actually decided to talk about that rather than R trees, which are spatial variation of B trees. But I'll be talking about those in detail when I get to lecture 13. I'm just going to give you a taste of that when I talk about access methods inside this lecture. And if somehow I end up with a little bit of time at the end, I'll say a little bit about R trees, the spatial variation of B trees. So the key compression. You want to have as much fan out as possible at the upper levels of the tree so that your depth of the tree can be minimized. There is no need to have exact traffic cop values at the higher level of the trees. All you need as a traffic cop function is, do I go left or do I go right? And of course, there are K values, so it's not just left or right there. Traffic cops that point you in, K plus 1 different directions. K traffic cops, K plus 1 different directions. Remember that the number of search key traffic cops and the number of pointers that you have one more pointer than you have traffic cops. This is the less than and the greater than, for the last values, for first value and last value. So basically, as an example, you want to distinguish between Dannon Yogurt, David Smith, and Deborah Rakonda Murphy. you can abbreviate David Smith to DAV, right? And all the keys can end up being compressed as traffic cops. You want the exact values in the leaves, but the traffic cop values don't have to be exact values. You can basically say, I'm gonna find everything which is greater or equal to Dave on the right, DAV to the right, and less than DAV is on the left. And so the traffic cop that you have distinguishing Dan and Yogurt and David Smith, you don't have to really write it out as DAV. You need that third letter, because you need to distinguish the DAN from the DAV. But you don't have the full thing out there, okay? Now you have to be careful, because suppose that there were a data entry that was Davy Jones, then, you know, you'd have to distinguish between, and Davy Jones would be to the left of the David Smith value. Then you can't compress down to DAV, you have to compress down to DAVE, or to DAVI rather, since it's David Smith. So again, compressing down to DAV would work only if the biggest value that you have on the left is gonna be less than the DAV. If Davy Smith is on the left, then you can compress down to DAVI. You can't compress down to something that, because Davy is DAVE, that's less than DAVI. You can compress down to whatever works that's gonna end up being less than that value with the things on the left, okay? So you compress down to the shorter string that allows you to distinguish, and that all works, okay? So what you need to be able to do, again, is to make sure that the traffic cop is greater than everything that's on its left. Clear? And so you have to be able to play with insert and delete logic suitably, because the biggest value on the left could change. So the insert, if you're gonna use this, again, you're squeezing more things together, but your insert and delete logic end up, you know, changing a bit, because you need to make sure that the traffic cops prefix compressed are still good after you've done the insert and delete. For insert, you may have to change things. With delete, you could leave it the same, but you might choose to optimize because you can do something a little bit better. But think about how that works. Questions about this one? Yes. Now we get to the bulk loader. Often what ends up happening is you load a mess of data and you want to have an index on that data. You could go ahead and load the data tuple by tuple by tuple and update the index entry by index entry by index entry, but that could be a really inefficient way of doing things. What usually ends up happening is you have a bulk load of the data and then a bulk load of the index on the data, because that can be done a lot faster. So you have a bunch of records inserted one by one by one is doable, it's slow. Bulk loading is much, much faster. What you do is you sort the data entries, not as data. You're sorting not the entire records, you're sorting the thing that you're building the index on. You're sorting the search keys with the RIDs. So you load the record. What you're gonna do is you're gonna have the record, the search keys and the RIDs for every one of the records. You know the RIDs because the data has been loaded. You know the search keys because that's what you're building the index on. It's a field that exists in the record. So you're sorting based on the state. You're gonna be, you know, sorting so that you can write all the California students and all the Hawaii students and all the, you know, Oregon students and all the rest of that stuff. So you take the data entries and you sort them. What's a data entry? We'll assume it's just search key and RID. And you've got all of that because you've loaded the data. You show the records and you get the search key and the RID. And you go ahead and you create the leaves of the tree. Yeah, and what you're gonna do is you're gonna point to the beginning of that stuff. You're gonna put in a root that has that stuff. And now what you're gonna do is you're gonna create the right of the tree and the rest of the tree. So basically, you're gonna be putting in the index entries. You're gonna be building the index going left to right through these data entries, splitting as you go. So you're gonna have a level above that's gonna, you know, point to what goes down. So you're building the tree from the bottom up. And you're gonna have as many levels as you need to be able to have in the tree. So you're gonna be building the level that exists just above it, and you're gonna be distinguishing, and then when you have to split, you're gonna build another level up above. So you're building the tree bottom up, not top down, as you go. And that's how the thing works, and it's gonna go, basically up to the root. It's much, much faster than doing it if you were inserting one by one. And we will be getting to concurrency control unlocking later, but usually when you're doing this, the assumption is that you're not gonna be, that you're not gonna be using the index while you're creating it. You can only use it after it gets created. And let me mention one subtlety, which I'm not gonna go into as part of the class, but is worth thinking about. Suppose that my data got loaded and I want to do queries on my data and inserts and updates on my data while the index is going on. Doing something which allows you to online create an index as a bulk operation. While the data isn't being changed, you can do what I've described here. If you want to be able to deal with a situation where you're building an index, I want to do a create index. My data's in operation, it's been around, I want to create an index. But my data is still being changed. That's a very interesting operation to do. Building an index with continuous availability of the data, including allowing insert and updates and deletes, is a very interesting thing to consider. Hint, you build the index on the data and then you keep track of the changes and you revise the index based on the changes. Trouble is there might have been other things that caused changes while you were dealing with the impact of the changes. So you built it on the data that existed, you keep track of the changes. Now you update the index based on the changes that happened. There were still changes that might have happened. It's sort of a kind of Zeno's paradox kind of thing, where you end up building. Because not that many changes can happen in that short a time. Eventually, there'll be something relatively trivial where you go ahead and you just hold the lock for a couple of milliseconds or less, and you go ahead and you do the update. There are other variations of it. I'm just giving you the scheme. Question?
So does this necessitate that you have the data in sorted order when you do
The data isn't sorted. The data isn't sorted at all. The data can be sorted by something totally different or totally not sorted. All that you're doing is you're sorting the data entries. You're sorting them by key.
Yeah.
You're sorting the data entries by the key.
Yeah.
Not by the page ID, not by the RID. You're sorting them based on the key. You're keeping track of the data entries, which consists of key and RID, etc. And you're sorting them based on key to be able to build this.
Yeah.
So a summary of this kind of thing. The multiple inserts is slow, and also it will not give you the sequential storage of the leaves. It gets kind of ugly in terms of how it works. It has great advantage if you do bulk loading for how you approach locking, fewer IOs and doing it. The leaves end up being stored as sequential pages. What do I mean by sequential? Well, particularly if we have this situation where next matters. It doesn't matter so much with SSDs. Having pages that are consecutive on the disk really matter. SSD doesn't really matter. Random IO is good with SSD. But storing them sequentially used to matter a whole lot. It's easy to control the fill factor in what you're doing. You can leave free space in the leaves when you're doing that, and split not when the leaves are when things are full, but you could go ahead and control it by putting the data into the leaves or even the things higher up and leave everything, let's say 2/3 full or all the rest of that. And there are lots of other things that can be done to optimize how the splitting gets done at the upper levels beyond what's shown here. This is just a simple summary on this. Let's talk about a term that I've told you was mythical, and tell you why it's mythical and why that doesn't matter. There is a term which we call D, which is the order of a B tree. And that was the idea that there were between D and 2D entries that you have on each page inside the B tree. That's the number of things that you have for filling up at least the number of things that you can put on a non-leaf page. Okay, and we would say, well, if it's between D and 2D, then that's where we can get our log, because it's never going to be worse than log to the base D. So our fan out is going to be between D and 2D. We use the term F for fan out, and we said the fan out is always going to be between D and 2D. And the reason why this ends up being mythical is that the index pages can have lots and lots of things in them. right? Because they just have to have this combination of the traffic cops and the page pointers. There are a lot of things that can fit in. But when you have variable size data, including variable size search keys, talking about things having, you know, a fixed size, that's why it's mythical. That's why it ends up getting complicated. And moreover, if you're using alternative 3, because there can be duplicates, you even end up having issues because of, you know, variable size things. If we're using alternative 3, there are lots of people that can be in California. So any kind of notion of you know, an order of the tree, and whether we're talking about leaves or non-leaves gets kind of complicated. What people really end up focusing on is keeping the pages half full, the exception being the root. Okay, so we keep pages at least half full. We keep the non-leaf pages at least half full, except for the root, and that again allows us to get the log factor of how things work. So just to very quickly summarize, because I have enough time to at least go through the ideas of LSM trees, there will be an entire lecture on LSM trees. They are really quite important these days. Log structured word tree, and they are not in the textbook. Tree structure and index are great for range searches. We've seen how this works with B-trees. They're also good for equality. ISAM was a very nice static structure, which again refers, I get my Goldwing DeLorean and go back in time. Well, around 1955, ISAM existed, maybe a little later. And very nice, only the leaf pages get modified. You put things in overflow, but the chains can degrade performance. Okay. B-trees are dynamic. You always have this log F thing there. The high fan out means that the depth, the way data used to exist, was rarely more than 3 or 4. It may be bigger than that these days. And having a B tree is better than a sorted file. The only case in which ISAM is really good is if your data isn't changing much. If you have static data, then ISAM is pretty good. But if your data is dynamic, B trees are better. B trees are dynamic. We talked about the reasons why. There are some issues with respect to how you maintain locking in B trees that we will talk about when we get to concurrency control. Basically, you have to be very careful about how B trees end up working. You do have to be a little careful about what an RID means in a B tree. This is where I want to talk a little bit about the use of primary keys instead of RIDs per se. So what I have on the chart should scare you, but don't worry, it's not as bad as that suggests. The page, if I'm using alternative 1 where the data is on a page, and I have an RID which tells me the page, what the heck is going on? Because the data is sitting on a page of the leaf of a B tree and the page changes. What's a slot? If I'm using alternative 1, then what I'm really going to be doing is not using RIDs. What I will be using, and Tandem did this, Tandem Computers, where I worked for about 4.5, 5 years on the transaction manager and system managed storage. Instead of having RIDs, what Tandem used was the primary key. So I'm looking for a record. If I'm looking based on primary key, I've got a B tree based on primary key. I can find the record. But what if I have a secondary index? So if I have my primary index, great. I look by the primary key. It's a B tree on primary key, terrific. But what if I have a secondary index? And the secondary index is, we said, you have the key in the RID, the key in the RID, the key in the RID. The difference is, you have the key, the secondary key, and the corresponding primary key. So I've got 100 records for California. I'll have California and the primary key of a California record. And I'll have California and the primary key of another California record. And California and the primary key of the third California record. Up to California and the primary key of my 100th California record. So how do I find all the students who are located in California? I look at my secondary index, I find the RIDs of all the students who are located in California, and I use the primary key to then find the actual records. Because the records are stored in the primary key index. Primary key index is using alternative 1. So again, when I use alternative one, the tandem style approach of using, instead of using their ID, using the primary key to identify the record. There's a unique record with a primary key. That's the whole point of a primary key. For a given primary key, there's either 0 or 1 record that corresponds to it. So by having, instead of having secondary key in our ID, I have secondary search key and the primary key, and that allows me to be able to find the record by searching the primary key index. Okay, that's another approach that's used. And there can be lots and lots of different indexes, and the indexes can be on lots of different combinations of columns. Key compression, as we saw, can help reduce the height of the B tree, although it's again a little more complicated, especially when you have inserts to maintain the key compression correctly, per the Davy Jones example that we looked at. Bulk loading can be much faster than just going ahead and increasing. B trees are extremely widely used. At this point, I would say LSM trees are a contender for an alternative to more widely used, particularly not just in databases, but other data management systems. Okay. Sequential scan used to be slow. Sequential scan is incredibly fast. We'll talk a little bit, I've already mentioned what some of the reasons why. When we get to parallelism, I'll say more about why sequential scan is way faster than it used to be. Indexes used to be really important. They haven't stopped being important, but they're less important than they used to be because sequential scan can be so fast. And now, in my remaining, oh, actually, we ended 10:45, so I actually have another 13 minutes. That's good. I'm not going to tell you everything about LSM trees, but I want to give you a taste of what's currently going on Access Paths. It stands for a log structured merge tree. I won't explain the name right now, but as we discussed, if you end up having splits, you could have a situation where if I have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red records in the leaf updated, it could propagate changes up the tree that have to get written out. So there could potentially be 5 persistent writes. 17 persistent writes. Look at the number of nodes that are colored red on this. Just look at one of these. When I change this, it might cause things to happen here and there and there and there. It might cause things to happen all the way up to the root of the tree. That's the worst case, but it could happen. So the number of writes, the number of persistent writes that I have to do could end up being big. It's not just one, it could be a bunch, because I care about the structure of the B tree. There are games that can be played based on that. Enter the log structured merge tree. And so the general idea of this is that I'm going to be keeping the records that I care about inside memory. I'm also, and we'll get to this, I'm also going to be keeping a log, which I'll be telling you a lot about when we get to recovery. I'll also be keeping a log so that I don't end up getting in trouble in case there's a failure. But when this ends up being full, in what I'll call L0, as in level 0, I'm going to be writing things out to a next level down. And I'll be filling in records inside that next level down. And now things could end up getting full at the next level down as well. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to write it to yet another level down. And let's say, just for purposes, I've got L0, and L1 can hold 10 of those. And L2 can hold 10 of those. And what's happening is I'm going to keep on going down the tree, and I'll be describing the file by a bunch of these L0, L1, L2, L3, ... sorts of things like this. So each one is 10 times bigger than the one that's next. It makes reading more expensive, because if I'm looking for the most current version of a record, I see if it's here. If it's not here, I see if it's here. If I find it here, then the other stuff is older. I don't have to look for older stuff, because it could be that there's a record that I keep updating again and again and again. So I found the earliest place where I have a value for, record with a given RID. I I look for the record, or I'm looking based on a primary key, let's say, and I find it. So I find the record, as soon as I find it, I know I have the most recent value, because things that are higher up the tree are more recent than things that are lower down in the tree. Okay? If I don't find it, I keep looking down the levels, and if I don't find it in any of the levels, then it's not there. And it's work to have to find things at all the levels. There are a couple of other things that can be done to help me search the level faster, which I will tell you about when we get to lecture 13. What's faster with this approach?
It seems like writes would be significantly faster, because you don't have to go to the conference writing to go.
Writes are only done at the top level. Except when I have to, something gets full and I have to shift it down, then I only have to shift it down one level. Reading is slower. What's called write amplification, which is a write turning into a bunch of different writes, is considerably better because in general, I only have to write at the top level. There is this notion of a log, which I will tell you about, which allows this thing to be persistent. But because I only have to write at that level, the possible slowness of writes, which can be important for me, ends up being better. The reads are slower. Again, there are gimmicks that can be used to make the reads not be as slow as what they look like. One of the things that I will mention is that when I, let's say, remember I can fit 10 of these things down here. When I go ahead and let's say I have this thing, filled up and I have to write it down there, I can get rid of old data if I want to. I can do some garbage collection. When I move this thing down, if I have 100 copies of the same record, I only have to keep the most recent one. So I can do garbage collection as I go. And in fact, when I take, let's say 10 things over here and I move them down, I can do garbage collection across those 10 things and move it down. So I don't have to keep, unless I care about time travel, or I want to go back in time, my DeLorean again. I don't have to keep all the old versions of the data around. So in fact, there's a lot of compression of things that can end up being there. So this is a real access path that gets used not just in database systems, but also a lot of other database data management systems in practice. Something that's used in something that Google created an open source called LevelDB, and a variation of that Facebook created, which is called RocksDB. Both of these are seriously used in practice, not only by those companies, but lots of other companies. So this thing ends up being very, very, very real. General idea of an LSM tree: you want to save on your writes, not slow down to be able to do them. This approach allows you to do it. The details about how this is done, that'll be in lecture 13. And since I do end up having a couple of minutes, I will say just a little bit about another access method, which I used to talk about in detail. I will say, I'll give you the slides for it. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I'm not going to try to put up the slides for it, but I want to tell you a little bit about an R tree. Suppose that I want to look for things where I'm looking for age between 20 and 30 and salary between 100 and 200. Or suppose that I want to look for things that are within 5 miles of Baskin Engineering. Well, let's stay with our latitude-longitude example. I could have an index based on latitude. I could have an index based on longitude. How do I find all the things that are within 5 miles of Baskin Engineering? Well, I can do a certain amount of index intersection across latitude and longitude. I can go ahead and have references to the things that were within this particular range of values with respect to it. But a better way of doing it is what's called an R tree. And here's the general idea, and I will be giving out the slides at the end of the term, but I'm just gonna, since I have 2 minutes, I'll just go through the general idea of this. I've got rectangles. I have a tree of rectangles. And let's say I keep track of which rectangles are within a given area. So what I do is I basically say, here are the things that are within this set of rectangles. And that's what the R tree does. It's an index based on rectangles. in the picture, which again, maybe I will have a chance to show you, sorry, I didn't expect to get this far, so I didn't add the slide to this. But basically, the picture says you're looking for things that are completely within this rectangle, or at least touch this rectangle, or something like that. Okay. You go here to find the things that intersect this rectangle, this rectangle here, the things intersect that rectangle. Now, parks or whatever it is, I'm looking for parks. Parks or rivers or whatever it is may not be rectangles, but I'm looking for things that intersect my rectangles. And so my B tree describes rectangles that end up covering or intersecting, depending on what I'm doing, a particular area. And that's the general idea. And R trees, again, are very much, and there are other variations, but they're very much used were used in practice. There are lots of other spatial indexes that exist now. So the general idea, and don't worry, I mean, I'm just hand waving this. I'm not gonna try to put the R tree stuff on an exam unless I actually go through the slides with it. The general idea is you define rectangles that end up intersecting the things you're looking for. These are the parks that may be in this rectangle, these are the parks that may be within that rectangle. There's a little bit of trickiness because things can end up being inside two different rectangles. Describing how you end up dealing, sorry about that, it's telling me my time is done. But basically, there, depending on what you're doing, there can be cases in which you may have things inside multiple rectangles, not inside one. So depending on what you're doing, you may put things inside more than one rectangle, or you may have multiple rectangles for different parks. There are a couple of different detailed approaches to that. And again, I'm just mentioning that there is this alternative access path. So we're just showing you that there are many different access paths. We will eventually come to dynamic hashing. But I believe that the next lecture is going to be about sorting, about external sorting, so we're going to go through that one next.